I know I can't yet see all of the students, but hopefully there will be time for questions and exchange. And they can see me, yes?
Yes, yes.
Great, wonderful. Okay. So yeah, so biographical note. Well, I think I'm a good example of somebody who really benefited from a liberal arts education, in the sense that I definitely didn't know what I was interested in when I got to college. And I had certainly sort of interests in Jewish studies, but they were relatively vague. And I didn't know in which direction that would lie. And I really had one of those experiences of essentially stumbling into the office of an exceptional professor and mentor who started me down the path of studying Jews in North Africa. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and this was Susan Gilson Miller, who's now at UC Davis. And it was really one of those things where I'd read a little bit about Moroccan Jews in a book, and I was curious, and somebody suggested that I go talk to her. So I did, and she said, "Oh, well, shall we do an independent study?" And that was not, that's not so common at a big university to have a professor volunteer to do an independent study. So I luckily for me, I was smart enough to take her up on it. And it was absolutely transformative, in the sense that she opened up the world of North African Jewish history to me. And I really, I had that kind of, I describe it as falling in love. I just felt like I was sort of, engaged intellectually in a way that I never had been before, and that I was just incredibly thirsty for more knowledge. I had already started studying Hebrew, but Susan Miller basically said, well, if you really want to do this, you must study Arabic. So I started doing that the following semester. And eventually, I went to Morocco. I conducted some research there. I started working in archives. And that's really how I got my start. Then I suppose there was another sort of turning point where I had to decide what kind of graduate program to go to. And that, I think already Susan Miller had sort of suggested gently, or perhaps strongly, that in order to really do the history of Jews in North Africa, I needed a foot firmly in Middle Eastern history and in Jewish history, that I couldn't really just do one or the other. And so I looked for a program where I thought I would get a strong training in both. And that's why I ended up going to Princeton, where I was in a Near Eastern Studies department that was primarily people working on Islamic studies and Islamic history. But my advisor, Mark Cohen, is a scholar of the Geniza and was firmly in the world of Jewish studies and Jewish history. And I was fortunate to make that happen, to be able to really do both.
If we should tell people to put questions in the Q&A box, or if they just raise their hand.
I'm getting a sort of feedback here. I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, I think that was Lori speaking.
Oh, sorry.
But now she's muted herself, so perhaps you want to say that out loud.
No, I had wondered. Yeah, it would probably be good if you're the only, or if the two of us are the only mics, and everything else is muted.
Yeah.
So I think that sounds, as I understand it, your interest in North Africa began when you were an undergraduate already. What is it about North Africa that captured your interest?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think some of it was, this is a little bit simplistic perhaps, but I think it's the experience that a lot of Jews in America have. I was raised with a not great, but it was there, a Jewish education. I went to Hebrew school, and I was always, whatever, I became a professor, so I liked school, including Hebrew school, even though generally it wasn't very pedagogically fantastic. And I came to college again with this sort of interest in Jewish studies and Jewish history, but really thinking basically that meant studying the Jews of Europe and America. I just knew nothing about the history of Jews in the Middle East. I'd never learned anything about it. And And this was a period, I went to college shortly after the Second Intifada started. And so I was reading a lot of news about the conflict in Israel-Palestine, and about really, well, also then 9/11, so just about the Middle East in general. And I think when I sort of stumbled into Susan Miller's office, I think one of the things that so captivated me was this idea that there was this whole Jewish world, Jews in North Africa, of whom, there was a very significant population, an incredibly long history, that I knew nothing about, nothing. Nobody had ever spoken to me about this part of the Jewish world. And I think I felt a little bit both kind of maybe peeved that I hadn't learned anything about it, and also deeply curious to figure out what was there. And then once I started really working on the topic, I realized that I was one of those scholars who prefers to go into one of those less traversed fields than the more traversed fields. Many people like to work on the American Revolution, which is a fascinating, wonderful topic, but there are already hundreds and hundreds of things written about the American Revolution. And I think one of the things that attracted me to North African Jewish history is that it was a relatively unexplored topic. There were still archives that nobody had looked at. There were big questions that nobody had asked, or at least not in much depth. And I think that, also once I was able to kind of combine research in Arabic and Hebrew sources, I saw that there was so much one could do with those skills that hadn't been done.
Now, in the case of North African Jewry, I mean, I'm a medievalist, so I can't walk out and meet people from my period. But if you're working on North African Jewry, there are lots of North African Jews still, or people whose parents and grandparents were from North Africa. When you were in Morocco, did you have interactions with the community there? And
I did.
Elsewhere?
Oh.
And did that affect your research at all, or your interests?
That's such a great question. I think that part of what attracted me to North Africa in particular, as opposed to other parts of the Middle East, is that there still is a Jewish community mainly in Morocco and Tunisia, not really in Algeria or Libya. Not that I haven't been to Libya. It's not a place that has yet really been safe for Americans to travel to. But I think that, from the beginning, the fact that I could go and that there was still a sort of, honestly, it even when I started my research in the early 2000s, the community was dwindling, and it has only continued to dwindle. So it's not, we're not talking a large community in either place. I originally, at the very beginning of my research, thought I might go more in the direction of ethnography. And I did spend some time doing very amateurish ethnographic research, which was fascinating and from which I learned an immense amount. But I also learned that I didn't really like ethnographic research, that I did prefer to work on dead people. So that was part of why I ended up working on the 19th century, because it was sort of close enough to the present to feel very, very relevant for a lot of the issues that people sort of think about today when people do think about Middle Eastern Jews, which isn't all that often in America, but nonetheless. And yet far enough in the past that it felt very unfamiliar, that it felt like there was a lot of need to undo our assumptions about the past based on the present, and to sort of, figure out how we got here, as opposed to imagining certain aspects of the present as eternal features of Jews in North Africa.
One of the things that I remember from the summer that I spent in Tunisia studying Arabic back in '76, first of all, you mentioned the Intifada, and the world events always impinge upon the little story we're trying to tell. And I recall being there exactly during Entebbe and kind of wondering how this would play out for, some of us were Jewish, and quite visibly so. But what I noticed that was very interesting is that among the Jews we met and spent quite a bit of time with in Tunis, a number of them, quite a few of them, were distinctly French. In fact, there was one gentleman who would walk around with his French passport or identity card in his pocket and was very careful to emphasize that he had French citizenship. And another fellow who in fact had to leave with his family at some point because somehow his Tunisian papers were compromised by his French citizenship. I never understood how that worked. I think his wife was also Italian, which at that time interested me because, of course, Tunis is no distance from Italy. And one had the sense that these boundaries between countries are pretty porous, but then international law could really impinge directly upon one's lifestyle. And then we visited the Jewish community in Djerba, and we discovered, one, that they didn't really speak French, but you could speak with them in Hebrew.
Mm.
And they had a much different localized identity. And I was wondering, if this is something that you had also encountered. That is, I'm sure you have. That is, we can't speak of North African Jewry in any way in a monolithic sense. There seem to be all sorts of variations in background. Are they all Sephardim? Well, you would have a lot to say about that, I'm sure. And I was wondering, in light of these sorts of questions, what you might have to say.
Right. No, I think that your basic point is absolutely correct, that there is no one thing such as North African Jewry by any means, and there is immense diversity within each of the sort of post-colonial nation states, as there was within the French Empire, both legally and culturally. I mean, Tunisia is, well, I'll tackle the question about Sephardi Jews first, since this is a Sephardi speaker series, and since your class has studied the history of Sephardi Jews. So not all Jews in North Africa identify as Sephardic in the strict sense of the term. Now, sometimes people use the term, as I imagine you might have discussed, sometimes people use the term Sephardi or Sephardic just to differentiate those Jews from Ashkenazi Jews, right? So it's a kind of catch-all for non-European. Other people use the term Mizrahi as that catch-all for non-European, but Mizrahi is a very recent term. It's something that has only been coined really in the 20th century, and it mainly applies to Jews in Israel who came from pretty much everywhere but Europe and the Americas. That being said, the lines of identity in North Africa have been, contested and sort of, fluid to some degree. There are some Jews in North Africa who are very insistent on their Sephardic roots, who trace their lineage all the way back to Spain. There are even Jews in the north of Morocco who preserved a dialect of Spanish as their mother tongue. It's known as Haketiya, which is actually an Arabic word, but it's like Ladino, which is the dialect of Spanish spoken by Jews mainly in the Eastern Mediterranean and the former Ottoman Empire, but it is somewhat distinct. It has different, influences from Arabic, slightly different usages, etc. And they retained that really until the 20th century, when when mainstream Spanish kind of took over. Elsewhere, there were lots of Sephardic Jews who also came from Spain originally in the 15th or 16th centuries, in Fez, in Marrakesh, in Tlemcen, in Algeria, in Constantine, in Tunis, all over the Maghreb. There was an influx of Sephardic Jews in the early modern period. The vast majority of them, other than those living in northern Morocco, where there was such a large number of Sephardic, they kind of overwhelmed the local population. Everywhere else, Sephardic Jews took on Arabic, and to a certain extent, eventually fused with the local community. Like Fez is a good example. At the beginning, starting in the 16th and early 17th century, there were two distinct communities. There was the Sephardic community, which were known as Megohashim, people who came, and the local, again, we don't really have a good name for it. Moroccan would be kind of anachronistic, Mizrahi would be very anachronistic, but the local indigenous to North Africa Jewish community who call themselves Toshavim, the residents. And for a long time, they were really at it. They had a lot of conflict.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
reading a little book that came out of Bar Ilan about a shechita controversy. I think
Absolutely.
in
It always
16th
comes down to
century.
shechita. It always comes down to
It always comes down to shechita,
how you
right?
butcher your
Exactly.
meat. That's the one thing the Jews
Right.
have the most
That's
trouble
ritual
agreeing about.
slaughter, permissible meat, not permissible, and it always
Absolutely.
comes down to they had separate synagogues, probably,
They had
right? The one
separate
they went
synagogues,
to and the one
and
they
the separate synagogues lasted at least into the 19th, possibly the 20th century. It's not clear. So there was the Toshavim as a kind of sort of organized community with their own minhag, with their own nusach, as it were, with their own sort of ritual traditions, to some degree got folded in eventually, but there was a synagogue that was reputed to maintain the original traditions of the Toshavim, of the indigenous Jews to North Africa in Fez, called Slat Fesiyin, the synagogue of the Fesis, of the Fezi Jews, that lasted into the 20th century. There was a lot of intermarrying and melding, and as in many places all over the Jewish world, the Sephardic Jews to some degree kind of maintained a certain status as the elite. So most of the big rabbinic dynasties from Morocco trace their lineage to Sephardic Jews, not all, but most. Particularly in places like Fez and Meknes, where there were big and influential communities of Sephardic Jews. But you also mentioned Italian Jews, and that's another way in which Sephardic Jews came to North Africa, particularly Algeria and Tunisia, where there was kind of a second wave of Sephardic Jews after that initial medieval expulsion that came much later in the 17th and 18th and even into the 19th century, who tended to come through Italy and particularly through Livorno. So in some places, such as Tunis, this community was known not as Sephardic, but as the Grana, which is the local Arabic word for Livorno, Al-Korna.
Right.
And they were the Livornese, the Grana Jews, who, again, the history of the Grana Jews has been sort of read a lot in retrospect, because in the 19th century, they got Italian citizenship. During the colonial period, they became very pro-Italian. Many of them became pro-Italian in a part as a way to kind of express their difference from the French. And so that Italianness was kind of retrospectively applied to the early modern community. It's clear that the early modern community was distinct, and indeed two separate communities were eventually created in Tunis, not until 1720, but there was a separation, different synagogues. It again came down to shechita, came down to kosher meat and taxes and other things. Obviously, they had a different minhag, but they didn't, the Italian identity. First of all, there was no unified Italy, right? But even a kind of Tuscan or Livornese identity was much less strong in the early modern period and became much stronger in the 19th century as Italy unified, as Italy became a kind of major player, or minor player at least, but in the concert of European empires. That sort of internal diversity of Jews across North Africa, both between Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and then within each of these countries, is part of what makes the place so fascinating. Because I think there is a bit of a tendency among Americans to think of North Africa as a backwater. It's not in the news a lot. When it is in the news, it's usually not for great reasons. Sometimes people go on vacation to Morocco, but it's still kind of like the Great Orient. And I think one thing that remains a little bit sort of fixed in our mind is this idea of North Africa as sort of isolated, as having preserved this medieval character. And that is just not true. North Africa was unbelievably connected to certainly the rest of the Middle East, but also across the Mediterranean. And Jews were always at the center of those connections. And that's, part, I would say more broadly, of what makes Jewish history so interesting, is because Jews have these transnational ties that make them sort of global avant la lettre.
Yes, I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and in part this is really because we were studying the question of Jewish status under medieval Christianity and under medieval Islam, and we did discuss the Pact of Umar and dhimmi status at some length, but then, of course, we come to the 19th century, and are Jews still living as dhimmis in the middle of the 19th century, or when does this change? And I know that you have quite a bit to say about this. In reading some of your work, I discovered some rather peculiar wrinkles to the whole question. But are they dhimmis in Morocco and Tunisia in the mid 19th century, the mid 1800s?
Right. No, it's an excellent question in large part because there isn't really a straightforward answer. I mean, for Morocco, it's pretty straightforward. They are definitely still dhimmis. Technically, Jews remained dhimmis in Morocco until 1956, until Moroccan independence. People tend to think that the French abolished the status of dhimmi. In fact, they never formally did. They abolished much of the sort of rules and regulations associated with the status of being a dhimmi, especially like the special tax, the jizya, certainly restrictions on clothing or on where Jews could live, things like that. But they never formally sort of said the Pact of Dhimma is over, and it was actually the government of independent Morocco that formally declared equality among all of Morocco's citizens. Interestingly, though, I think one of the things that I find very fascinating about the history of Jews in the Middle East is that we tend to have this model of Jewish emancipation that is shaped by the model of Europe, right? So either Jews are distinctive and subservient, right, like dhimmis, or they're equal and free, right? And though we have a somewhat binary, so it's either pre-emancipation or post-emancipation. But what's so interesting about North Africa and the Middle East more broadly is that those categories kind of break down, because in Morocco, for instance, to this day, Jews are full and equal citizens, but they are not under the same law as Muslims, because Morocco has retained the autonomy of Jewish law for matters of personal status, meaning Jews in Morocco still have to get married according to Jewish law. They still have to divorce according to Jewish law. Any matters of child custody or inheritance, all of that is taken care of by rabbinic courts. So actually the only place, as far as I know, the only two places in the world where rabbinic courts still have full jurisdiction over matters of personal status for Jews are Morocco and Israel. If somebody wants to,
which is of course absolutely remarkable, yes. Especially for Americans, who are used to, well, City Hall for one marriage certificate, and then whatever ceremony you have in church or synagogue or temple, right? So the other thing I suppose is that people often associate colonialism and the system of the different protectorates, the course of the 19th century, with a change in Jewish status. And right. First of all, this process of, broadly speaking, do we call it colonialism? I suppose, for lack of anything else, yeah. It doesn't happen in a unified fashion, right. But up to the 19th century and into the 19th century, formally, most of these countries are part of the Ottoman Empire, right?
Absolutely, yes.
So
yes.
Does Ottoman law figure into this story at all?
Yes, it does. And again, what you just said, that we have this idea that colonialism tended to be the equalizer for Jews, that, when the French came in, and that's certainly how the French wanted us to think about it. In fact, that's kind of still how many French people want us to think about it. But it's wrong. It's wrong in the case of Morocco, as I said, but it's actually even more wrong in the case of Tunisia, because Morocco was never part of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, the Moroccan Sultan was sort of actively resistant to the kind of reforms that called for the abolishing of the dhimma. There were many people who said, you should abolish the dhimma, you should make Jews equal. And the Moroccan Sultan said, no, I rule according to Islamic law. This is what Islamic law prescribes for Jews and Christians. In Tunisia, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, but a semi-autonomous state, Ottoman law did not automatically necessarily apply. So there were some very important reforms undertaken in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century that are generally called the Tanzimat, although even that term is problematic. But nonetheless, as part of this process of reform, the Ottoman Empire formally abolished the status of dhimmi for Jews and Christians in 1856. Then the Ottoman Sultan sent, a letter over to the Bey of Tunis, the ruler of Tunisia, and said, now I'd like you to promulgate this decree. And actually the ruler of Tunisia was like, no, thank you. I don't want to. I'm, a semi-autonomous, I mean, I'm simplifying, but basically I'm semi-autonomous. And I'm not interested in these new rules, but for various reasons, including intense pressure from foreign diplomats, the Bey of Tunis was eventually essentially forced to promulgate a version of the Ottoman decree, which was distinct. It wasn't a translation. It was really its own thing, but it did formally abolish the status of dhimma. However, it was worded in such a confusing way that while it said that Jews and Muslims are equal before the law, it also then continued to refer to Jews as dhimmis, such that in the months following the promulgation of the decree, there had to be a committee formed of experts and government officials and ulama of learned scholars, of Muslim scholars, to basically explicate the confusing language of this decree and sort of figure out, well, what was the status of Jews, and were they fully equal, et cetera, et cetera. And what the Tunisians came up with was essentially that Jews were no longer dhimmis, but again, they were still under Jewish law for matters of personal status, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a similar kind of, equalizing, but without making everybody exactly the same.
Now, I know that you have a wonderful project that you've been working on, which I would say this is an example of microhistory. I mean, it looks like a very complex and engaging court case, which I think we've got enough time for you to talk to us a bit about that. And I'm not sure my students have encountered the term microhistory, so perhaps that would even be worth discussing. How one delves deeply into a narrower topic and then uses that to extrapolate and to consider much larger pictures. So if you're up for this now, would you like to talk for a bit about this project?
Oh, yes,
I won't
sure.
even introduce it. I'll leave it entirely to you.
No, I'm very happy to speak about it. And when one is so deep in a project, one can go on for a long time. So you'll have to stop me. You'll have to tell me when we're getting towards the time when I should stop speaking and we can turn to questions.
Sure.
So I think that's a great way to begin. What is microhistory? We academics, we're so into these jargony terms that we use and kind of expect everybody to understand implicitly, and the rest of the world doesn't use them necessarily. And so
Right.
I think it's important to say what we mean. Microhistory is a sort of tradition within the historical sort of range of methodologies that basically tries to take one kind of case, whether it's I mean, in my case, it's in the book that I'm writing, it's actually a legal case, but it could be a person, it could be a town, right? One little town, generally not a big city, because a big city is usually considered too big to be a sort of microhistory, but like a village. And some of the most famous microhistories have been these very detailed studies of a single village in a short span of time, 10 years, 20 years. In the Middle Ages or in the early modern period. And the idea is to use this very detailed, fine-grained study where you almost get to know people from the past as a way to talk about bigger historical questions and bigger trends and problems in history. I would say that, most microhistories tend to be pre-modern. Certainly the most famous ones tend to be from the medieval period or the early modern period, but that it's one of these tools that really any historian can use. And I was attracted to doing a microhistory in part because I like to read history that feels alive, where you feel like you sort of get to know the characters, where you feel like you're almost caught up in a plot the way one feels when one reads a good novel. And when I stumbled on the case that I'm working on, which is a case about a man named Nissim Shamama, and when I started doing a little bit of research around it, one of the things that really attracted me to the case was, it was this sprawling case, but it had all of these different characters from all of these walks of life. I mean, Nissim Shamama himself is a fascinating guy. He was Jewish, born in Tunis, to a family, some of his ancestors were rabbis, but he became this incredibly powerful government official. He was the minister of finance. He was the head tax collector for the entire country of Tunisia. And this was all in the 1850s, actually before Jews were made equal to Muslims, before the abolition of dhimmis, of the status of dhimmi. And this, I think was not was not unheard of. It was somewhat exceptional to have a Jew rise to such a high status in North Africa, but it wasn't unheard of. There are many cases of it from the medieval and early modern periods, actually from across the early modern world, and even from the modern period, less so for Jews, but certainly true for Christians, especially in the Ottoman Empire. So this is something that is there, but again, kind of challenges our assumptions of what we think we know about the Middle East, right? It's this Muslim world. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that I really want to communicate as a scholar and a teacher is that the Middle East and North Africa were unbelievably diverse places. And in some instances still are. The diversity has reduced enormously in the 20th and 21st centuries. Some of the diversity is reduced even in the last 10 years of upheaval, especially in places like Syria and Iraq. But in North Africa, North Africa had a significant Jewish population almost everywhere until really the middle of the 20th century. And some of those Jews were very powerful. And so I was attracted to the character of Nissim. And then I started digging further and I realized that there were all these other people who were involved in the case. There's a really powerful Muslim government official, a man named Hussein ibn Abdallah, who was actually a Mamluk, which is a type of slave, a sort of elite slave who was born somewhere in Circassia, sort of in the kind of near where Armenia and Azerbaijan are today, and was enslaved at a young age, brought to Istanbul, and then eventually to Tunis to be a sort of essentially a military slave, a soldier slave in the household of the Bey, along with a whole number of elite slaves. This was a pretty common practice across the Mediterranean, at least across the Islamic Mediterranean. And right. Hussein ibn Abdallah, he was eventually freed, but he became this very important high-ranking government official. And he ended up moving to Italy to work on the Shamama case. So maybe I should introduce the case a little bit before I go too far down the road of saying what attracted me to it. The issue at the center of my book and what originally got me interested in Nissim Shamama is basically that he died. Everybody dies, but he died leaving this vast fortune. He was one of the wealthiest men in Europe when he died. He died also not in Tunisia, because had he died in Tunisia, the future of his fortune would have been very clear. Everybody would have known exactly which law to apply and how to divide up his wealth. He never had children, but he had close male relatives, and his money would have gone to them, no problem. But he died in Italy. He had left Tunisia about a little under 10 years before his death. First, he moved to Paris, then he moved to Italy. And not only did he die in Italy, but he possibly became an Italian citizen. And the question that arose immediately after his death was, how do we distribute his estate? And to answer that question, the courts in Italy had to know what his citizenship was. Was he a citizen of Italy when he died, or was he still Tunisian? And so this really, sprawling is only begins to describe it, this absolutely vast lawsuit that lasted a decade, that had, multiple stages. I mean, there were all of these different sort of, people going to court at different times, various levels of appeal, lots and lots of lawyers. I mean, like more than a dozen lawyers working on each side, including two of the very most famous jurists working in Italy at the time, people who were world famous in their day, and are still, at least one of them, a guy named Mancini, is still the kind of person that, every historian of international law knows his name. He's in every kind of standard account of international law. And he was working on this case because it was such a large amount of money, and it became this kind of almost cause célèbre about what citizenship is and how one determines it. And so this is what attracted me. Nissim Shamama himself and his life is very interesting, but it's really this debate after his death that got me hooked on this subject. And so after he died, there was this big battle, and it involved people like Hussein ibn Abdallah, who came from Tunisia to Livorno, which is where Nissim had died, and lived there actually for years and years and years, kind of managing the case. There were all of these different relatives of Nissim Shamama who wanted to inherit and who moved to Livorno to try to stake their claim. Nissim Shamama, as I said, had never had children, but he had a great niece whom he had sort of adopted. She had moved to live with him when she was very young. When she married and had her own child, she remained in his household. When he left Tunis for Europe, she came with him. And he left a will, which was, of course, very contested, in which he gave her and her young son half of his fortune. And so she was this central player. And it's very, it was very exciting to be able to work on a case that had a Jewish North African woman at the center, because Jewish women from North Africa are less visible for this period in the sources. They don't write. They tend not to be literate, so they tend not to write as much. So I was very excited to be able to work on a project that had the whole family, including all of these really powerful women, sort of front and center.
Is part of the issue that she's a woman and therefore inheritance law might differ depending on where she is?
Yes. So fundamentally, the legal question came down to this. If Nissim was Tunisian, if he had died a Tunisian national, right? If he was still a Tunisian citizen, then Jewish law would apply to his state, because, as I said, Jews were under the jurisdiction of Jewish law in Tunisia, right? In that case, somebody like Aziza would not be an automatic heir. And, sometimes Jewish law can allow Jews to write a will, but the will that Nissim had written did not seem like it was going to be at all considered valid according to Jewish law. Actually, that in itself became a subsidiary question of the case, whether Jewish law could validate a will like Nissim's. But in any case, it certainly seemed like somebody like Aziza, who wasn't a close male relative, would not inherit, and all of his money would go to his 3 surviving nephews, one of whom was Aziza's estranged father, a guy named Momo. His name was Shlomo, but he was nicknamed Momo. The names are also really great in the story. If, however, Nissim was determined to have died as an Italian citizen, and remember, I said that he might have gotten Italian citizenship, but whether he did or not was sort of one of the questions in the case. Then Italian law would apply, and then the will that he had written would certainly stand up, and there was no problem with a woman like Aziza inheriting according to Italian law.
Under Italian law. But wait, the whole notion of Italy is also relatively new, right?
Very new. So Italy, when does it start? The Risorgimento is usually thought to have started in 1848, but the major unifications don't really begin until the late 1850s. That's when Tuscany, where Livorno is, became part of unified Italy. But Italy as a country, it's really 1861, and then it doesn't get a civil code until 1865. Nissim Shamama dies in 1873. So this is all immediately after
it's all brand new.
The legal unification of the country. And indeed, these famous lawyers so this guy Mancini, who worked on the case, helped write the civil code, and then was arguing over what the civil code meant and how to apply it in court. And this was interesting in part because it was one of these very early big cases where Italian judges and Italian lawyers were trying to work out what Italian law said, right? In addition to what Jewish law and Tunisian law and international law said.
International law, exactly right. Questions of jurisdiction.
Absolutely.
And doesn't Tunisia begin to lose financial independence just around this period in the late 1860s or something?
Absolutely. So that's also part of the story. Nissim Jamama, while he was Minister of Finance and head tax collector of the country, was also involved in getting Tunisia its first major international loans, which at the time were seen as a way to sort of shore up a treasury that was failing. It was a way to invest in the modernization of the country. And that was something that countries all over the world were doing, right? Both in Europe. I mean, there was an enormous amount of investment in building trains and railroad tracks and steamships and telegraph lines, right? And this was also true outside of Europe, in certainly in North Africa and the Middle East, but in Latin America and Central America. The problem was that the banker who ended up loaning money to Tunisia, as with many of the bankers who loaned money to other states like Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, and basically charged a somewhat not necessarily usurious, but a pretty steep rate. And there was a lot of shady hand waving, such that the loan was very disadvantageous. Plus, Tunisia, the Tunisian government officials who had entered in the loan had been overly optimistic about their revenues and their ability to pay the installments on the loan. So they quickly fell behind. They needed another loan to pay for the first loan, and then another loan to pay for that loan. And Nissim Shamama was at first central in all of this. Then actually in the midst of all of this kind of financial meltdown, there was a huge rebellion in Tunisia, which was partly against the raising of taxes, which was done to pay for these new loans. You can imagine that Nissim Shamama was not very popular because he was the head tax collector, obviously directly involved in these questions of taxation. Nobody likes to have their taxes raised. And this was when he left Tunisia. He certainly feared for his life, either as, just the symbol of the financial administration of the government, or perhaps it was more widely known that he was involved in these international loans, which had started to kind of sink the economy. It didn't actually become, crystal clear that these loans were bad for Tunisia, for the Tunisian treasury, until a few years later when the country officially declared bankruptcy. And indeed, the exact circumstances under which Nissim left were debated at the time, are still debated today by historians. But in any case, yes, he left in part because of this sort of financial meltdown, which he himself did have a hand in.
So was the Tunisian government in any way a party to the lawsuit? I mean, either directly or indirectly? And if so, how would that work?
Right. So, okay. So after Nissim left, probably not until close to his death, accusations began to surface that he had been one of the corrupt officials that had helped lead Tunisia down the road of bankruptcy, not just by getting this international loan, but also by skimming from the treasury, essentially, by shady dealing, by taking money for himself, et cetera, et cetera. Once he was accused of this, the Tunisian government became determined to recuperate money that it accused Nissim Shamama of having stolen from his estate. The problem was the Tunisian government didn't have the proper proof, right? Normally, when you claim to be a creditor on an estate, then you can go to the courts and say, here's what this guy owed me before he died. Please take that money out of his estate and pay me. The Tunisian government tried to collect this information, but they just couldn't. They either didn't have the proper sort of record keeping, the proper accounting, or the proper accounting didn't prove their case. And so they basically didn't show it. But they didn't want to give up. So instead, what they did, which was something, again, a little bit fishy, Nissim's nephew, whom I mentioned, the guy named Momo, who was the father of Aziza being his sort of adopted daughter. Nissim's nephew, by this point, was also working for the government. Momo had basically replaced Nissim as head tax collector and had, in his turn, racked up a lot of debt to the government, not to mention that, he sort of owed his job to the government. And after Nissim's death, when it started to become clear that the government wasn't necessarily going to be able to prove their claims on the estate in court, Some very high-ranking government officials, the prime minister, the foreign minister, essentially called Nissim's nephew, Momo, into a room and said, Momo, we'd like you to sign this contract in which you will give us a quarter of whatever you get from your uncle's estate. Momo couldn't very well say no, so he did. And after that, the Tunisian government became an official party to the lawsuit because Momo was trying to claim part of the estate as one of the 3 living male descendants, which according to Jewish law and thus Tunisian law should be the only heirs to the estate. So the Tunisian government became involved as a sort of basically party to Momo's claim. And that's why they sent this guy, Hussein ibn Abdallah, to Livorno. They hired lawyers, they employed a Jewish sort of translator come intermediary, a guy named Eliyahu al-Maliach or Leon al-Milek, who was originally from Algeria actually, but had moved to Tunisia and sort of, knew Hebrew and French and some Italian and Arabic, and agreed to kind of work on the case. And the Tunisian government became also very active in trying to buy up shares of the various heirs, right? So they went to other heirs and said, well, if you let us basically represent you in court, we will pay you a lump sum now, and then you don't have to worry about what the courts say, and you don't have to wait for this endless lawsuit to be over. You can get your money right away. And they succeeded with at least one of the major heirs that way. And that's part of what makes the case so interesting also, is that the Tunisian government was directly involved in making claims about the legal issues at hand. What did Tunisian citizenship mean? What was the status of Jews in Tunisia, etc.
Oh, I think we better ask you before I forget what the outcome of the case was. Was there a winner? I have a feeling I know where this is going.
Right. Well, a part of me feels like I should say, oh, well, you have to read the book.
Wait for the
I
book.
won't be that cruel. So what's funny about this case, in some ways, funny, more tragic, is that it went on for so long, and both sides, it was almost like an arms race of legal representation. Both sides hired such expensive lawyers that everybody ran out of money. And while everybody was sort of slowly running out of money, this Franco-German banker, a man named Émile Derlanger, who was originally from a Jewish family, but had been baptized at birth, his father had converted to Catholicism, who nonetheless was perceived as Jewish in the very anti-Semitic way that many French people had of the 19th century, of perceiving somebody who had converted still as Jewish. So this guy was perceived as Jewish, even though he wasn't sort of, halachically or technically Jewish, and who happened to be the one who had made these shady loans to Tunisia, which sunk the Tunisian treasury in the first place. He had met Nissim Shamama in Paris. He knew about Nissim Shamama's estate. He knew about the case and the lawsuit. And a few years after Nissim's death, once people had already poured in lots of money to the lawsuit and were starting to run out of money, he sort of quietly went behind the scenes and negotiated with one heir after the other to buy up all of their potential shares in the estate.
Their shares. Okay.
Finally, he did the same thing with the Tunisian government, and he said, look, I'll just buy up whatever claims you have and we'll agree to split it a certain way. And so eventually the entire estate belonged to this banker, Émile Derlanger. And essentially by that point, it really didn't matter which way the courts ruled, because he was going to get the money either way. And it became largely an academic question. The courts, of course, did rule, because they're courts and, these processes had started. In the end, they ruled that Nissim had died a Tunisian citizen, that he had not managed to acquire Italian nationality, that Jewish law applied to his estate. But in a twist that really, I think, nobody expected, the judges decided that Jewish law actually did validate his will, that his will, even though it seemed to lack all of the requirements for a kosher will, nonetheless should be considered valid. And in this, he relied heavily on arguments by Italian Jewish lawyers and an Italian Jewish rabbi, who essentially argued for the validity of the will according to Jewish law in these long legal briefs written in Italian. And so ultimately he decided that even though Jewish law applied, the will should be upheld, and Aziza Nisim's adopted daughter should inherit half of the estate. Again, by this point, it didn't matter because Aziza had long ago sold off her shares to Diann.
Right,
So really, it was the
exactly.
banker, the slimy banker, and all of the lawyers who, of course, collected these astronomical fees for their work, because it doesn't matter, you know, they all got paid whether they won or lost. They were the ones who really won in the end.
So in order to study a case like this, what are your sources?
Yeah,
Presumably
that's a great question.
trial transcripts or something.
There,
But are
I
there
did
also
find, yes, I did find some trial transcripts. All of the actual legal proceedings took place in Italy. So I did go to Livorno and Florence and Lucca, which were the three cities in Tuscany where the case went through, you know, from the sort of court of first instance up through the courts of appeal. The rulings themselves were published actually in sort of, you know, official Italian publications, but I would say the bulk of the material for the case comes from the Tunisian archives, which kept these, you know, enormous dossiers, dozens of dossiers of archival material about the case, correspondence, some between Nissim and various officials in the government before he died, and then a lot between all of the different players after Nissim's death. So especially people like Hussein, the lawyers sometimes, the Italian, the sort of not official consul, but the sort of consular representative of Tunisia in Livorno, who wrote, you know, pages and pages and pages about the trial. And this material is in lots of different languages. The archival material, I would say, is mostly in Arabic. Some of it is in French, some of it is in Italian. And then the Jewish legal aspect of the case is also pretty interesting. And there were a lot of responsa written in Hebrew by rabbis all over the Mediterranean, from Jerusalem, from Tunisia, from Italy. There's a sort of the case itself became something of a cause célèbre just among rabbis. So there was all this sort of very traditional halachic literature written about it. And then there is some of that is in Judeo-Arabic. Mostly, I would say it's in Hebrew. So I would say, you know, another thing that kind of attracted me to the case is that I had to fit all of these different languages together to form this puzzle to sort of understand the whole thing. And it really does connect all of these different aspects of the Mediterranean and of Jews in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, not just the languages, I suppose, but also very different legal systems.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. Yes. And that was, you know, trying to kind of translate, not in a literal sense, but in a conceptual sense, from international law, Italian law, Jewish law, Islamic law, Tunisian law, which was, you know, its own thing, right? There were decrees that had been passed by relatively recently by the beys of Tunis that became really, you know, important parts of the lawsuit. How do we interpret them? What do they mean?
So for you, what are the repercussions of the case? I mean, did it have repercussions at the time, and then also for your own work as a historian?
Right. That's a great question. You know, the case, interestingly, was there. It had repercussions for specialists in international law, and you know, it's cited somewhat in that field, but it didn't become one of those kind of watershed cases, in part just because the Italian legal system doesn't work like the American legal system, where precedents have this incredibly important power. It's a civil law system, so everybody just goes back to the code, and each judge is essentially free to interpret the code the way he or she sees fit without necessarily going back to precedent. So legally speaking, it didn't make that much of a splash, or, you know, it wasn't a kind of turning point for Italian law or for Jewish law, really. I mean, again, for Jewish laws at the time was completely decentralized. And because there was no, there was no way to sort of say, well, this is the only Jewish legal authority that has the power to decide what Jewish law is. There was just this multiplicity of voices all disagreeing about what Jewish law said about this case. What I think is important about the Shamama case is more what it allows us to see in this moment, as you sort of hinted at already, of really the construction of an enormous number of ways of thinking and organizing the world that today we take for granted. So the very notion of citizenship, what it means to have citizenship, how one determines that, right? Today we think of the proof of citizenship as a matter of, relatively straightforward paperwork. You get a passport, you have a birth certificate, whatever. None of that existed in the 19th century. So just how do you determine who is a citizen of which country? And also what, the sort of fundamental, almost ideological and legal bases for citizenship were very much up for grabs. Again, I think the way we tend to think of citizenship is part of what I'm trying to push against here. We tend to think of citizenship as the province of the West, essentially, either as something that was invented, in the ancient West, ancient Greece, right? And the polis and Athens and democracy and all of that. We tend to think of citizenship as something coming from there. Or we think of it as this very kind of modern Western, basically starts with the French Revolution or the American Revolution. We have these modern forms of democracy that emerge, and that is what citizenship is. And so what I do in the book is I actually try to move us away from that term, citizenship, or cognates like nationality or subjecthood. And I coined this term legal belonging, which I see as a neutral way to describe many different ways in which people could be in a state of relationship to the state, right? In other words, a citizen belongs to the state, but a subject also belongs to the state. A Jew belongs to the state, even though he might be a dhimmi and thus technically sort of, lower in the social hierarchy. And part of why I do this is because I think it gets us away from the idea of who invented citizenship, right? Because instead we see legal belonging as something that really exists in every state, because in every state there's this sense of people somehow belonging to the ruler, and the ruler having certain sort of rights over those people, like jurisdiction, et cetera, and also certain obligations towards those people, like the obligation to provide justice, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want people to start thinking of citizenship not as something that gets invented in Europe whenever you locate that invention and then exported to places like Tunisia or Morocco or, sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or East Asia, but rather as a concept that was very much in the midst of being worked out in Europe in the late 19th century, and that was often worked out in conversation with these non-Western countries, right? So that's what you see happening in this case are Tunisian Jews, Tunisian Muslims trying to figure out how to explain what belonging means in Tunisia, according to Islamic law, according to Jewish law, to these Italians who are also trying to understand what belonging means in Italy. And so as opposed to a kind of, as opposed to a Eurocentric vision of the invention of citizenship in Europe, I see legal belonging as something that has existed across a number of different polities, pretty much across the world in different forms that then gets sort of translated into this language of international law late in the 19th century.
I mean, one way of gauging citizenship would also, of course, be the rights and obligations of the citizens. And presumably those are also changing in exactly this period. Let me ask if there are any questions from the classroom here. I've been monopolizing discussion, but enjoying this very much. Does anybody have a question that he or she would like to pose to Professor Margolin? Yes, Zachary, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much for your time. So the other half of Nissim's wealth, where was that going to? And couldn't they just have said, okay, we'll get one half, you get the other?
That's a great question. Let me just repeat it to make sure I heard it because the sound quality isn't 100%. If I understood you correctly, you asked about the other half of Nissim's will, right? Because I mentioned in his will, he gives half of his fortune to Aziza. So what about the other half? That's a great question. So I think I mentioned that Nissim had 3 living nephews when he died. One of them was this guy, Momo, Aziza's estranged father. And Momo was almost entirely cut out in the will. Nisim gave him 25,000 francs, but the man was worth 27 million francs. So that's essentially like a normal person being like, here's $5, like go buy an ice cream, right? It was essentially an insult to Momo. The other half was split between these two nephews, whom, because Nisim and Momo had a falling out, right? Clearly Nisim did not like Momo, but he still liked his other two nephews, not quite as much as he liked Aziza, but he still liked them. Their names were Nathan and Joseph. So in the will, they each got a quarter. Nathan and Joseph weren't all that excited about this arrangement, however, because if the will was thrown out and Jewish law was applied and the whole estate was split just between the three living nephews, then each of them would get a third. So Nathan would get a third instead of a quarter, Joseph would get a third instead of a quarter, and Momo would get a third instead of this tiny kind of almost symbolic sum that he was given in the will. And so actually Nathan and Joseph also moved to Livorno and also sort of embarked on this long legal battle for the estate. And again, this is, it might seem kind of sort of petty, right? A third versus a fourth, does it really matter that much? First of all, the numbers of millions of francs at stake was really high. So the difference between, a third and a fourth was millions of francs. And thus got people, made people willing to work really hard to try to get that difference. And second of all, the fact of fighting over an inheritance is almost universal among from time immemorial. Families fight over inheritances. So in that sense, it's not at all surprising that even the nephews that got some, a fairly large chunk in the will still kind of joined the fray.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Margolin. That was a wonderful conversation and a wonderful lecture. And it was a pleasure for me personally to meet with you. And Professor Rudovsky here would like to close out. And again, I hope we have an opportunity to meet sometime in person without masks.
I hope so too, yes.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for your wonderful questions.
And let me thank Professor Frank. I mean, you did a marvelous job. I think the conversation, I love the dialogue format, and I think it was just a wonderful exchange of ideas. It makes me want to sit in on the rest of your class, if this is how all your classes are. But I'm also sorry, and I do want to say that you were not our FIBO speaker, because this would have been a perfect talk as well. So we may have to still invite you back to give the FIBO lecture on law and Judaism.
I will not say no.
Because so many legal details here. It's just really a marvelous topic. So thank you very much. And
thank you. This was such a pleasure.
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
really wonderful. Thank you all for your attention, for your excellent questions.
Yeah, no, excellent.
you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Okay, so I think we just log off at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.